This is the Business Breakfast with Richard Dean, Brandy Scott and Tom Urquhart.
On the UAE's #1 talk radio station, Dubai Eye 103.8.
Good morning. You are listening to and watching the Business Breakfast. Tom, Rich and Brandy with you, 6 o'clock on the dot, Thursday morning, penultimate day of yet another week. Let's have a look at our top stories that we're covering for you this morning.
Coming up more on all of these top stories. Plus, as the UAE launches a new retirement savings fund, we're speaking to a man who's been running a similar scheme in DIFC for years. Wilson Varghese of Zurich, here at 7:30.
Good morning. You are listening to the Business Breakfast, where we're looking ahead and looking after our future.
You're happily retired now. Hooray for you. Happily retired now. What you gonna do? There's books to read and golf to play, naps to take, have fun all day. You're happily retired today. Hooray. Oh yes, you're happily
But is it going to be happily retired? That's going to depend on how much money you have, not so much in the bank, but in the investment account. And that is one of our themes this morning. We have both, if you like, an anniversary of a scheme and the next scheme to come. Shall we start in the DIFC?
So we've got Wilson Varghese in at 7:30 from Zurich, because DIFC has been doing this for 5 years, essentially taking the old gratuity system and turning it into something more like a US 401k or a European pension, where you pay in every month to an investment fund, and that's your fund and you control it. The gratuity system sits on the money just sits on the balance sheet of the company you work for, if you're lucky. And then if there's money there when you leave, then you get paid out. If the company goes bust, then you don't. So this is how it works at the moment. I'm looking on the Zurich page for the DEWS system in DIFC. What happens is you make a monthly contribution, or your employer makes a monthly contribution into your DEWS account, so the employee's DEWS account. And the amount is based on your length of service and basic salary. So if you've been there less than 5 years, it's 5.83% of your monthly salary a month. So if you're earning 10,000 dirhams a month, that would be 583 dirhams every month goes into Richard or Tom's or Brandy's DEWS savings account, a Zurich investment fund. If you've been there for more than 5 years, it jumps up, much as the gratuity does. So if Richard, Brandy and Tom are working in DIFC earning 10,000 dirhams a month for 5 years or more, every month 833 dirhams goes into our Zurich savings account. And like any investment fund with a Zurich or a firm like that, you know, we can decide what we want. Do we want a low-risk fund? Do we want a medium-risk fund? Do we want a high-risk fund? Do we want a Sharia-compliant fund, for example? But it's ours. And Tom controls it, or Brandy controls it, or Richard controls it. Right, that's the DIFC scheme, been running for 5 years now. What Lunate announced this week was a fund that's going to be available to companies across the UAE, outside DIFC, whether you're in a free zone or onshore, doesn't matter. Your employer can choose to do this. So they can, your employer, not you, your employer can choose to have this scheme so that they will pay into that kind of system. You had the guys, say Fikri, at Lunate, an Abu Dhabi investment fund, calling it tectonic, which is a big word. I'm inclined to agree with him. I think this is a big deal. But am I getting too excited?
Straw poll in the office?
Straws. My favourite straw of choice is... No, I think the system's bust, needs fixing, and this is an alternative, isn't it?
Yeah, I'd go along with that. Brandy?
I would rather have the money doing something than sitting stagnant on a balance sheet. There are questions about it, though, and we're going to be speaking to one finance expert this morning, Steve Cronin, about how it's good for employees, which is the obvious. Your money is doing something, it's growing. It's not just sitting there. You've got the option to top up, if you like, make contributions alongside what comes out of your salary. What does it mean for employers, though? They don't have access to the money that otherwise would be sitting on their balance sheet. cash flow is everything for companies. We know that money should be ring-fenced, but what does it actually mean in practice? That's one question. And how do we make sure that people are, A, paying the right fees, which is the biggie, isn't it? Because the difference between paying sort of 1% and 2% and paying 3 or 4% is massive when it comes to how much you end up with at the end of the day. And how you make sure that you're in the right one, that you're not invested too conservatively or too riskily. Because the difference between this and a pension is that, as our disclaimers like to say here on the Business Breakfast, investments go up and investments go down.
You could lose the money, exactly. And again, I'm looking on the Zurich website. I mean, there's various different funds you can buy into. You can choose if you want to go into their most high-risk fund is what they call their Global Shariah-compliant equity fund. And then, you're at the mercy of the swings and arrows of the stock market. So, yeah, you buy into that and the stock market crashes as it did in March 2020 when COVID hit, or whenever else it might be, the global financial crisis, then the value of your fund will go down. Or you can choose to put it in a money market fund where you're going to earn very little return on it, but it's pretty much fixed and it's rock solid. But that is your choice, and typically younger people should be taking more risk, older people should be taking less risk. I'm looking for the DEWS total fees, and I can't find a fee at the moment. I was looking last night as well, but from memory, we've spoken to various people involved in it, and the annual fee is just over 1%.
Which is fine, because 1 is kind of where you want to be aiming at. I was having a look, and I can pull it up now, actually. I think, paying too many fees. The guys from SAWA the other night have given me a couple of slides showing what happens if you are paying too much in fees, and the difference between paying 1% a year. If you put sort of 100,000 in, and if we're 10,000 rather, and if we assume that the stock market's rising sort of 7% year on year, 10,000 invested. Thank you, Sawa, for these graphs that I'm stealing and using without permission whatsoever to broadcast them. But it's fairly easy maths. If you pay 1%, you lose about $18,500 in fees. If you pay 4.5%, you're losing $55,000 in fees. So you are losing over half of your investment. There's a big difference.
There is a big difference, and your mate Andrew Hallam, who's in town at the moment, the guy who wrote the Expat Millionaire book and has long campaigned against investment firms, financial advisors charging 3, 4, 5% annual fees on investments, has said, that can really hammer your investments.
Because compounding.
Exactly.
Fees compound in the way that your money's compound.
Yeah.
So to speak.
But it's over 1, it's between 1 and 2%. I know that. I'm looking at one website that puts it at 1.25 to 1.5%. But that's why we've got the guys from Zurich joining us live in the studio at 7:30 to answer these questions, because they do charge a fee. Yeah, Zurich's a company. If you want them to manage your money, they will charge a fee. So there will be some fees. It's just what level are they exorbitant fees or not?
Citibank.ae and enjoy 1,250 dirhams welcome offer. TNCs apply.
This is the Business Breakfast on Dubai Eye 103.8.
With Abu Dhabi Global Market, the ADGM app is your ultimate platform for business success. Available in the App Store and Google Play.
Right, let's talk about investing and saving for retirement. Joined in the studio by the Senior Executive Officer of Zurich Workplace Solutions, Wilson Varghese. Morning, Wilson.
Morning, Richard.
And we've asked you to come in for a couple of reasons. Partly because we got very excited this week when Abu Dhabi's Lunate investment company announced that they're going to be rolling out an investment scheme basically to replace the gratuity system in the UAE, so employers can invest their gratuity as they go in an investment scheme. But also because 2025 marks 5 years since you guys did something very, very similar, pretty much identical, in DIFC with the DEWS system. And Zurich was one of the founders of that system and remains involved in it. So it's great to have you here. Let's talk about what you've learned over the 5 years, and just remind us what you introduced 5 years ago and why it was so different from the old gratuity system.
Thanks, Richard. So, absolutely, I think it's a great feeling for us to have completed this milestone. This really was a pioneering initiative of the DIFC after a lot of meticulous planning and deliberation. And what it fundamentally did was to reshape and reimagine the end-of-service benefit system. The traditional system that most of us are still very familiar with is one where your employer would pay you at the end of your service based on a calculation of your salary and years of service. But the employees really didn't have visibility, transparency around that, and also control. And what the DEWS system did was provide all of those three things. Employers could now see that the money was in a separate pot under their names. They could see how it was invested. They could choose to invest it differently if they had a different risk appetite. So it fundamentally reshaped end of service, and what was then a pilot, an experiment, is now very safely called a successful case study. So we're very pleased with how it's turned out.
Even at the time, 5 years ago, we were saying this has got to be some kind of trial run for something broader across the UAE. No one said it was just a DIFC thing, but we and others all thought, surely this has got to be the future. And it seems that we're getting there now with this announcement from Lunate. And others have done something similar, National Bonds have done something similar as well. What do you expect in terms of rollout of something like this across the UAE?
Yeah. So, Richard, we see that this is an idea whose time has come. There is a template in place, and it's really positive to see the UAE once again being at the forefront of this kind of change in the future, for the future, and leading the region in that respect. What we expect to see is obviously this regulation take place. Providers come in, develop their propositions, develop operational scale to be able to offer this. And at some point in the future, we expect that this will go down as well, potentially the mandatory route, which would be, setting a very high standard for what employees can expect when they join any firm in the UAE, which is fantastic for the nation.
We've had lots of questions in about this. Let me throw them at you. For the DEWS system, the one you're involved in, Priyanka writes in, what are the fees that we pay as investors?
So broadly, there's two broad categories of fees. One is a fee that is paid for the administration of the services. So you have a trustee that's involved, and they obviously have a very central role in, fiduciary responsibility for the employees and employers. So it covers their fee. It covers the investment advice fee for the investment manager, and of course it covers the administrative fee as well. And then apart from that, based on the investment choice of the employee, there's also an asset management fee that you would associate with a fund. But all in all, they are strong value for what an employee gets and receives, in exchange for that visibility, control, and also the opportunity to grow their savings over a period of time.
So let's put a number on it, the total expense ratio for this fund. I've read, and I was looking for the numbers this morning, I couldn't find them. It's about between 1% and 2%. But you tell me.
Yeah, absolutely. So the provider fees are a fee of 1.23% of the fund. And then, of course, there's an additional asset management fee. And those are at institutional share classes. So they're negotiated with really, really good rates. And those range from anything from 0.03% to 0.3%. So they're really in the range of somewhere between 1.3% to 1.6%, 1.7%.
So the total that people are paying is about 1.3-ish%.
Yeah. The average would be about 1.3 because that's what the 1.3, 1.35%, yes.
Okay, that's good to know because there have been concerns in the UAE in the past about people buying into investment products, and you'll be familiar with this, and paying total expense ratio fees of 3, 4, 5% buying into these 10, 20-year savings products.
Yeah, absolutely. So we believe that this is actually very strong value for money for our employees and employers. It's a digital first provision. There's a very robust governance in place. And so all of these things add up to providing that credibility, that trust, and of course, ultimately as well growing the investments over time. We expect as well as scale develops in terms of the assets under administration that those fees will actually start to reduce as well, which we fully expect to happen.
More questions coming in. This one is anonymous. I know the name, but I'm not going to read it out. Thank you very much indeed. Talking about this, the I'm paraphrasing what he says, but it's about the fact that his salary, what he earns every month, only a small portion of that is actually his basic salary, and therefore his contribution to this scheme or gratuity is only based on the basic salary rather than the full monthly wage that you get paid. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah.
How does that work in DIFC?
Yeah, so it works similar in the DIFC as it does in the federal UAE as well. But effectively, this is the employment law of the land, where it's the basic salary on which the contributions are calculated. So that's different for different employers. But what I'd say here is employees do have the opportunity to also make additional savings into the scheme from an automatic payroll deduction. And typically that kind of a savings scheme is significantly cheaper than any retail product that's actually in the market. So I'd say if an employee is looking for saving a larger quantum, obviously the employer they're bound by their employment contract and the labor law in terms of what they expect to be contributed, but they have the opportunity to top that up as well.
How many people are opting to top it up? Because as it stands at the basic level, if you've been working for a company for less than 5 years, it's just over 5% of your monthly salary that gets paid in. And if you're more than 5 years, it's just over 8% of your monthly
correct.
salary. Fine, that's standard. You don't have an option about that. That's mandatory. What are you seeing in practice?
Yeah. In practice, we're seeing actually that there are some employers who want to use this as a strong employee value proposition and are actually going well above the
so the
minimum.
employers are chipping in more?
Yes, absolutely. So we see employers chipping in as much as 10 and 12%, even though the law mandates a minimum of 5.33 or 5.83 or 8.33. So it's not a large number of employers, but there are a good number of employees who are actually doing that.
That's an attraction and retention tool.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Our guest this morning is Wilson Varghese. He's Senior Executive Officer at Zurich Workplace Solutions. Wilson, we're getting loads of messages in. Can you stick around for another 5 or 10 minutes or so and answer those? Thanks very much indeed. Get your messages in 04871 5500 on WhatsApp.
Yeah, don't forget your name. 4001 is the other old-fashioned number you can use with us as well.
Back you. Discover more at weo.io.
This is the Business Breakfast on Dubai Eye 103.8.
With BizAway, delivering the future of travel.
Good morning, you're listening to the Business Breakfast. It is 8 minutes to 8.
Our guest this morning is Wilson Varghese, Senior Executive Officer at Zurich Workplace Solutions. Wilson, thanks for staying with us.
Thanks, Rich.
We're talking retirement planning at the moment. That's because earlier on this week, Lunate in Abu Dhabi announced a retirement investment scheme effectively to replace the gratuity scheme for workers across the UAE. But partly because it's 5 years since DIFC, the financial centre, launched exactly that kind of scheme. It's called DEWS, and Zurich was one of the main companies involved in it and still is. So, Wilson, thanks for staying with us. Let's get to those questions. Ajaz has written in with a few questions here saying, I would rather put my money into a pension scheme where I can select my investment, and also saying the fee structure is not very clear. And I know Ajaz works in DIFC, so let's unpick those.
Sure. I think that's a great question, and I'm really happy to expand on that. One of the strongest advantages or benefits of the DEWS plan actually is choice. There are 11 or 12 fund choices that an employee can choose. Of course, there is a default fund if they don't make the choice, but they have the opportunity to choose between risk profile funds based on whether they're conservative investors or adventurous investors. There are self-select funds, and of course, in the DIFC, there's a good population that's very savvy about investing. And of course, we also offer 3 funds that cater to those who want to invest according to their Islamic principles, so Sharia compliant funds. So you can mix and match. You can switch from the palm of your hand on our mobile app. So it's one of the strongest suites actually is investment choice. So that, I think, answers one part of the question. And with respect to fees as well, once again, actually, people have an opinion about our fees because they are clear. They have an opinion on whether it's too much or too little. We believe that's strong value. And actually, retail investors under the DEWS scheme are getting access to institutional share classes, which translates to significantly lower fees than they would pay if they were buying these products on a retail basis.
So just to clarify, you mentioned this earlier. The basic fee is about 1.2, 1.3% as an admin fee.
Yeah, 1.2% as an admin fee. Yes.
And then the various funds you can pick, they have their own fee structures. But you were saying the one you're invested in, because you are an employee in DIFC, is 0.03% is the fee.
Absolutely, that's right. So the passive global equity fund has a charge of exactly that, 0.03%. So literally my total cost is 1.25%.
Let's talk about investment advice. Questions in saying, okay, that's great, but we don't get an investment advisor. An app is great, but it's not a Wilson saying, oh, well, maybe China's looking strong or America's looking weak or whatever it may be.
Yeah, great question. And I think this is one that we get quite commonly as well from employees. One of the things we do consistently is actually we run a lot of education and investment webinars. Now, of course, advice is quite personal and needs to be bespoke and tailored to the needs and the risk appetite of the individual. So we can't offer individual advice to people, but general principles around investing. We've got, a knowledge series on our portals, on the app. So we provide and cater for those things on a general basis. But of course, investors should always understand their risk appetite, take professional advice on a personal basis to make choices if they wanted to do anything beyond the default fund.
And the point, you could pay for that advice. I mean, we and others have been quite critical of sometimes the high fees that the investment community charges because advice is built in. The flip side of that is, okay, if you don't want if you want lower fees, then you don't get the advice.
Correct. Absolutely. So, point well made, Richard. And the one thing I would say, though, is with this engagement, there's a couple of nuggets of data I would like to share, which actually shows how engaged the employees are with DEWS. We've actually seen now on a regular basis for the last a year and a half, that more than 10% of our contributions into DEWS are from employees who are choosing to transfer in their previous accrued gratuity from their employer into the DEWS scheme because they're seeing it invested.
Okay,
and,
so I can do that.
Good results.
So if I've got $1 million invested in an investment portfolio somewhere else, I don't know, with whoever it may be, I can just move that into DEWS.
You couldn't move it from outside of payroll.
Not outside
of payroll. So you can make additional contributions within payroll. But let's say your employment predated DEWS. Let's say you're an employee who's been in service for 10 years.
Yeah.
So 5 years worth of your end of service is actually still with your employer, and 5 years worth is with DEWS because it was a monthly payment. However, you can choose to accrue, bring in the previous accrued gratuity. And finally, I'd like to add as well, we're actually seeing 8 to 10% of our employees remain invested with DEWS even after they've left employment because they're happy with those returns. And that's another choice you have. It doesn't have to get liquidated when you leave service. And for us, obviously, people vote with their dirhams, and these are good indicators for us.
Speaking of the returns, we've had this question a couple of times. For 2024, what were the returns like? I'm looking, the S&P 500 was up more than 23%. I know there's a range of risk in the funds, but what kind of returns did those invested in DEWS see? Yeah,
so it's broad, obviously, because there are various risk profile funds. I'll give you a quick example of the one I was invested in. Passive global equity last year returned more than 30%. In 2024. We have benchmarks for each of our funds. So, your default fund is meant to ensure that it keeps pace and beats inflation. And each one of those benchmarks across our funds have actually been met. So, obviously, the most adventurous funds have had a good year last year. Such as the Passive Global Equity, the High Growth Fund, the HSBC Islamic Equity Fund. They've all done really well. And then, of course, you've got others who've had more of a mix of, bonds and equity, and therefore the more conservative funds have returned less than that, but higher than the benchmark.
And of course, if you go for the higher risk one, there are going to be years when it's down 15%.
Absolutely. So that's why we give people choices based on, on their risk appetite. And the default fund is one that is a low moderate fund, so it's a conservative fund, but people can choose to move out of it. And
How did the default fund do?
Off the top of my head, I'd probably say it was about 5 or 6%. Because obviously that's a more conservative fund. I might be wrong. So I think it's best to check on our fact sheets, which obviously are updated every month. But it's beaten inflation and it's done better than its expectation.
I have to say, my thought is I've been an employee at this company for 11 years. So presumably I've got 11 years of gratuity. The S&P 500 was at 1,800 points when I joined. Now it's at 6,000.
Yeah.
I'm thinking, if only
Yeah.
my gratuity had been invested in that. But anyway, we have to start somewhere. Wilson, good talk to you. Appreciate your time this morning.
Pleasure being here. Thank you so much, Brandy and Richard.
The thoughts of Wilson Varghese, Senior Executive Officer at Zurich Workplace Solutions.